Winter, 1943. A line of men crouches in a frozen trench on the Eastern Front. Their breath hangs white in the air. Their coats are threadbare. Their boots are cracked from endless marches. Across the ridge, a column arrives. Cleaner uniforms, new winter parkas, tanks that gleam with fresh paint and thick mantlets. These are the Waffen-SS, banners, crisp insignia, the kind of kit that makes a frontline soldier glance over and wonder why his own unit was not so lucky. Which side in that moment looks stronger? And which side, when the war is measured in months and manpower, actually was more effective? Before further detail, the Waffen-SS were not simply another military formation. They were part of the criminal Nazi apparatus responsible for horrific crimes. This is not an analysis that excuses, romanticizes, or neutralizes that truth. What follows is an examination of how Hitler's institutional choices, the creation and privileging of a parallel, ideologically loyal military force with direct political access, had strategic consequences that helped accelerate Germany's collapse. The central claim is straightforward. Hitler's single strategic mistake was not a one-time tactical blunder on a battlefield, but the decision to institutionalize and favor the Waffen-SS, to build a separate armed force that answered politically to the party and to Hitler, received preferential equipment and logistics, and fought by doctrine and loyalty that often ran counter to long-term military sustainability. In short, he privileged politics over coherent, nationwide military efficiency. That choice bought tactical bursts of fierce fighting, but bled Germany's limited resources and veterans at a rate its economy and manpower could not sustain. To understand how a political decision became a strategic fault line, we need to follow 5 threads. What the data actually show about Waffen-SS composition and casualties, how tanks, winter clothing, fuel and ammunition were allocated, the differences in doctrine and their human cost, how dual command and political access warped battlefield decision-making, and how all these factors aggregated into strategic failure. Along the way, we'll flag uncertainty. Historians debate many of the figures, records are incomplete, and some memoirs are self-serving. But even allowing for those caveats, a pattern emerges. Historians estimate that, out of the dozens of formations raised under the Waffen-SS label, only a relatively small number were genuinely elite in training, equipment, and performance. Conservative scholarly estimates put the number of truly elite, full-strength Waffen-SS divisions, those comparable in quality to top Wehrmacht formations, at roughly half a dozen to a dozen, with a common figure cited around 8. That number is contested. Some sources expand it, others contract it. What is less controversial is the composition of the rest. Many SS formations were raised from foreign conscripts, men of widely varying quality, who often received accelerated training and filled roles that Wehrmacht units usually handled. When scholars average combat effectiveness across the whole Waffen-SS, the result is closer to parity with the regular army than to the myth of universal elite status. At the same time, the elite SS divisions that did exist frequently recorded extraordinarily high casualty rates in operations where they were committed. Quantifying that casualty gap also comes with large margins of uncertainty. Post-war analyses and division studies suggest that in certain operations and periods, elite Waffen-SS formations suffered casualty rates possibly 40–70% higher than comparable Wehrmacht units in similar actions. These figures should be read with caution. They depend on which battles and time frames are selected and on patchy wartime record-keeping. Some of these analyses come from post-war military historians and analysts who compared unit after action, while others draw on captured documents and veteran testimony. The point is not to fix an exact multiplier in stone, but to underline a pattern. SS units, when used in high-intensity assaults or held as shock troops, often paid a steeper price in men and commanders than their army counterparts. Why did this happen? Equipment and logistics played a large role. Germany's industrial capacity in the later war years was not infinite. Choices had to be made about which divisions received the newest tanks, spare parts, winter clothing, and the fuel and ammunition to sustain operations. The Waffen-SS, by virtue of its political position and direct channels to Heinrich Himmler and to Hitler himself, was frequently favored in these allocations. Where Wehrmacht tank battalions might receive a rotating share of heavy armor, some SS formations gained semi-permanent concentrations of Tiger and Panther tanks. Those allocations had an immediate tactical effect. When a crisis loomed, SS commanders often could marshal heavy armor quickly, while Army formations waited for rotating transfers or patchwork repairs. That disparity extended beyond tanks. Accounts from frontline supply officers and some surviving diary entries indicate that winter clothing, boots, and even fuel were sometimes diverted to SS units ahead of others. Records are messy, and the archives preserve a great deal of bureaucratic paperwork that can be read multiple ways. Still, the pattern reported by multiple contemporaneous and post-war sources is consistent. Political channels translated into tangible logistical advantages. In a theater where a soldier's survival often hinged on a proper winter coat or a functioning tank, these differences mattered. Doctrine amplified the effect. The Waffen-SS did not simply arrive with better kit. In many cases, they fought under a doctrine of aggressive, assault-centered tactics that prized decisive action, shock, and individual unit heroism. That approach could achieve stunning tactical results. Combined with preferential equipment, SS units were sometimes able to break local stalemates and seize objectives when an Army unit might have faltered. But doctrine is not an abstract virtue. It trades lives for outcomes. Aggressive frontal assaults and an emphasis on offensive elan tended to concentrate casualties among officers and experienced NCOs. The cohesion that a shared ideology and fierce leadership produced was frequently purchased at the cost of attrition among those who carried institutional memory and battlefield judgment. By contrast, Wehrmacht doctrine, especially in its pre-1943 form and among many of its remaining professional cadres, emphasized combined arms cooperation, reconnaissance, and the conservation of trained personnel where possible. That approach was more sustainable in a protracted war of attrition. It did not always produce the headline-grabbing breakthroughs that the SS sometimes did, and in certain desperate moments, Army commanders intentionally ordered or accepted high-risk operations that looked very like SS tactics. But when Germany's strategic problem was limited manpower, increasingly scarce fuel, and an industrial base under strain, a doctrine that minimized avoidable losses among experienced cadres was strategically preferable. The human cost of SS doctrine was not an abstract statistic. Officer casualty rates were notoriously high. In some formations and seasons, division commanders and company commanders were replaced repeatedly. Entire cadres of veteran, non-commissioned officers vanished in a matter of months. Again, exact percentages vary by study and by period, and historians debate whether the SS suffered a higher rate of officer losses across the entire war. What is clear is that the cumulative effect of repeatedly bleeding experienced leaders, whether through doctrine, attrition, or political expectations that units must stand and fight regardless of cost, weakened the German Army's institutional backbone. The structural problem that made these tactical and logistical disparities so destructive was command fragmentation. The Waffen-SS was, by design and statute, part of the SS and the Nazi Party. Administratively, it answered to Himmler and to Central SS authorities. Operationally, for much of the war and especially on the Eastern Front, SS units were subordinated to Army group commands for tactical employment. That created a dual chain of command. An SS officer might receive operational orders from an Army Corps commander in the morning and a direct political directive from SS headquarters that afternoon. The consequences were predictably messy. Army commanders found their ability to manage the front compromised. They could not always withdraw SS units when a tactical retreat made sense because political apparatuses might intervene. Requests by Army logistics officers to reallocate fuel or repair parts were sometimes overridden by SS channels that referenced party priorities or the need to maintain an image of unbroken strength. The result was not merely administrative friction. It was battlefield paralysis in critical moments. Units that should have been consolidated, rested, refitted, or repositioned remained engaged until they were exhausted or destroyed because the political hierarchy demanded that they hold ground or make a stand. Those were costly stands in manpower and materiel. There are documented instances in which such clashes had tangible outcomes. Army commanders in multiple sectors reported difficulties in coordinating operations where SS units refused to conform to withdrawal orders or where SS proclamations demanded priority resupply. In the aggregate, these recurring instances formed a pattern. The political loyalty of SS units made them less flexible tools of the field commander, and their preferential logistical status diverted limited resources from formations that might have used them more sustainably. That combination, politically shielded combat units that consumed resources and veterans at above-average rates, is the heart of the strategic mistake. It helps to imagine the war as an economy. Every tank, every set of winter boots, every experienced platoon sergeant is a scarce input. A rational allocation in a constrained system aims to maximize battlefield effect per unit of resource. Preferential treatment of a politically connected subset of units can appear rational in a particular crisis. Sending elite-look troops to stabilize a break in the line can buy time. But when political favoritism becomes institutionalized, the allocation instead reflects political calculus rather than strategic efficiency. Over time, that slowly drains the capacity of the conventional military to regenerate combat power. Elite SS formations that survive for a month after a politically motivated commitment might produce propaganda value, but the long-term effect is to shorten the lifespan of the army as a whole. There is also an ideological dimension to consider. The SS oath of personal allegiance to Hitler, rather than to the state or to an abstract professional soldierly ethic, created incentives that ran counter to prudent military stewardship. A soldier whose primary loyalty is to a leader and a party may be less inclined to heed orders aimed at preserving forces for a future decisive engagement, and more inclined to fight for immediate political aims. That loyalty also shaped the type of recruitment and promotion within SS formations, favoring political reliability over strictly military competence in many billets. The result was a force that could be extraordinarily loyal and destructive, yet uneven in quality and detrimental to systemic sustainability. All these factors feed into a strategic calculus. The Waffen-SS, as an institution privileged by Hitler and by Himmler, consumed disproportionate amounts of Germany's scarce materiel and human capital. It did so in ways that produced short-term tactical advantage on multiple occasions but long-term strategic cost. Preferential distribution of heavy tanks and supplies, combined with aggressive assault doctrine and political insulation from ordinary army discipline, accelerated the attrition of experienced leaders and diverted supplies from units that would perhaps have used them more sustainably across a wider front. At this point, some important caveats. First, the historical record is messy. Wartime paperwork was lost, destroyed, or never kept in consistent formats. Many post-war memoirs served the self-interests of authors trying to shape the narrative of their participation, or to distance themselves from wartime culpability. Some Wehrmacht memoirs exaggerated SS recklessness to obscure their own failures, while some SS accounts inflated their elite status. Second, not every SS unit performed poorly. Elite formations like the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf demonstrated tactical competence and at times played decisive roles when used judiciously. But even these elite units were not immune to the strategic dynamics described above. Their successes often came with unsustainable casualty lists and created incentives for further preferential treatment. Third, historians disagree on the magnitude of the effect. Some argue that Germany's industrial limits and Allied strategic bombing campaign were the decisive determinants, and that the SS's role was marginal in the larger collapse. Others place greater weight on institutional distortions and the politicization of the military as accelerants of systemic breakdown. The truth, as is often the case, lies between extremes. The SS was not the only factor in Germany's defeat, but its privileged status compounded other structural weaknesses in ways that made German resistance less sustainable. A careful counterfactual is tricky and must be presented as hypothetical. It is probably incorrect to claim, as some popular treatments have suggested, that Germany would have won had the SS never been prioritized. That would ignore production shortfalls, the sheer scale of Allied material superiority, and strategic mistakes elsewhere. But a restrained counterfactual, one that historians are comfortable discussing, asks, would a more unified command, and a more equitable allocation of equipment and veterans have lengthened Germany's ability to hold ground, avoid catastrophic officer and NCO losses, and conduct more efficient defensive operations? The balance of evidence suggests the answer is yes, at least to some degree. A coherent, non-politicized force tends to manage attrition better over time than a system that channels scarce inputs to politically favored shock troops. An important nuance here: the Waffen-SS's political advantage was not merely Himmler's personal preference. Hitler's obsession with loyalty and ideology, the party's paranoia about dissent, the propaganda needs of a regime that relied on displays of fanaticism. All of these created a systemic imperative to showcase politically reliable units. The creation of a parallel force was not accidental. It was baked into the regime's priorities. The strategic mistake, therefore, was as much a political one as a military one. Hitler subordinated the logic of a rational military allocation to the logic of political survival and myth-making. Return for a moment to that frozen trench. The Wehrmacht officer watching SS ranks pass may have envied the shinier jackets and the newer guns. He may have resented the diverted supplies and the political strings that made his own requests less likely to be filled. He may also have recognized in a private moment that a victory that cost his best men and his most experienced sergeants could not be sustained. That recognition, the implicit calculus between short-term spectacle and long-term sustainability, is precisely the heart of the argument. Hitler's mistake was not merely to create an effective assault unit, it was to channel resources and political privilege into that unit at the expense of systemic coherence. To be clear about what this analysis does not say, it is not a defense of Wehrmacht officers or an attempt to exonerate institutional complicity in crimes. The army itself was not a moral paragon. It was part of a criminal state and participated in criminal operations. Nor does it attribute every German loss to SS favoritism. The war was shaped by many interconnected causes: Allied industrial power, coalition strategy, logistics, intelligence, and Hitler's own strategic misjudgments on multiple fronts. What this argument asserts is narrower and evidence-based, institutionalizing a politically favored parallel force and then allocating scarce resources to it preferentially produced strategic costs that exacerbated other weaknesses. There are moments in the record that illustrate the institutional tensions. Commanders complained about the inflexibility of SS units in withdrawals. Supply officers noted disproportionate shipments of winter gear to SS formations. Post-battle reports recorded the loss of veteran cadre in units deployed repeatedly in frontal attacks. Some of these reports are fragmentary. Some come from sources that may have had their own agendas. But the convergence of multiple lines of evidence, administrative records, veteran testimony, division studies, and careful post-war scholarship, builds a convincing pattern. When Hitler consistently preferred politically loyal units with privileged access, the military system around them contorted. It is worth addressing a recurring historiographical debate directly. Some scholars have argued that the very existence of elite SS units provided Germany with a flexible reserve of combat power that could be committed to crises and thus offered strategic advantage. This is true in a very narrow sense. When a crisis emerged in late 1943 or 1944, commanders could throw SS formations into the maw and stabilize a sector that might otherwise have collapsed. Yet those fixes were temporary. Stabilization by throwing elite, politically protected formations into the line often meant those formations were exhausted and could not be relied upon later. In a war defined increasingly by sustained resistance and industrial capacity, temporary tactical gains cannot substitute for systemic sustainability. As the Red Army pushed west and as Allied forces accumulated material and strategic advantages, Germany's options narrowed. The policy of privileging the SS did not produce a decisive strategic swing. It shortened the lifespan of Germany's professional combat corps and consumed replacements and materiel at a rate the war economy could not replenish. That dynamic matters in thinking about how strategic outcomes are produced. Wars are not won only by brave last stands or heroic offensives. They are won or lost by the steady arithmetic of production, replacement, training, and command cohesion. A policy that consistently shunts resources toward politically favored units undermines that arithmetic. The conclusion returns us to the image that opened this examination. The officer in the trench sees the SS column, polished and ready, and feels a mixture of envy and foreboding. The immediate impression is that these troops look more effective. Measured over weeks, months, and years, the larger picture looks different. The short-term firepower of politically privileged shock troops came at the expense of long-term resilience. The strategic mistake was institutional, creating and privileging a parallel armed force that answered politically to Hitler and Himmler, and letting that institution skew the allocation of Germany's scarce resources and veterans. We must also remember the moral context. The Waffen-SS was an instrument of a genocidal regime. Any analysis that isolates military efficiency from moral culpability would be incomplete and dangerous. This examination is explicit in its condemnation. The study of organization, logistics, and doctrine does not separate those subjects from the atrocities committed under the SS banner. Understanding how Hitler's choices affected military outcomes clarifies, not absolves, the political violence those choices enabled. So, who was more effective in the long run? The politically privileged Waffen-SS or the conventional Wehrmacht? The short answer is that the Waffen-SS sometimes outperformed the army tactically, but that tactical edge was typically bought at disproportionate strategic cost. Hitler's one strategic mistake was to institutionalize that trade-off, and to let political priorities, rather than a rational allocation of scarce national resources, determine who got the best tanks, the warmest coats, and the most immediate resupply. If this analysis changed how you see the rivalry between these institutions, leave your prediction in the comments. In 1943, looking at that frozen trench, which side would you have bet on for long-term effectiveness, and why? If you want more systems-level historical analysis like this, subscribe for future episodes where we map how institutions, logistics, and political choices shape outcomes in war and peace.